everybody, the First Principles Podcast. This is the podcast dedicated to analyzing environmental, economic, cultural, all that fun stuff from a First Principles analysis. Okay, so today is the episode where we will be focusing on COP26 that recently took place in Glasgow, Scotland. COP, now what does that stand for? It is the Country Council of Parties? What is it?
Council, Commission, Corporate.
We literally just looked this up.
Conference of the Parties.
Conference of Parties. And I guess it basically it's a collection of a lot of the major world powers. And the objective or the goal, from my understanding, is they are discussing climate objectives, climate goals, climate initiatives, everything related to climate, global warming, climate change, all these things, setting goals, setting objectives related to everything from trees and deforestation to carbon emissions to methane emissions, a wide assortment of things. And to me, honestly, generally when these types of things happen, from my point of view, I'll just say high level, I'm very skeptical of these giant conglomerations of nations. I'm very skeptical of the UN, for example. So I just want to let you know what my bias is coming into it. So, if I say something, okay, he's generally of this nature, of this character, somebody that maybe is skeptical of these large politicians coming together for their high and mighty objectives and trying to achieve things that perhaps could be achieved through lesser means. But I digress. So that is to say that whenever we have a union of these various nations towards some sort of goals, it's more often than not, I feel like it's more of administrative red tape, more administrative burden, more those things in place as opposed to actual hard boots to the grounds, get things done and things of that nature. So that's my hesitance of these things. So that's why I'm like, okay, another one of these things. Let's see what happens. But yeah, what are your thoughts on that, Elliot? Because I know speaking beforehand, you kind of had a different take on it.
Yeah, I mean, from doing a bit of research on these talks over the years and the whole Paris Agreement that was set out 6 years ago in 2015, I had always just thought of them as good intentions by countries to come together as a community to address some overarching problem that's facing the planet. And mostly what I knew about them was what I heard about in the media, that often they fell short. There was some idea of what needed to be done that was based on studies and analysis and the science and
the science.
That's right. One of those words that just get tossed around a little bit too much without people really understanding what it means now. They were so I didn't think too much of them. I didn't, in the same way I was like, it's possible that these things are doing something, but there's also, it's possible that they are a waste of time, and there's actually other agendas at play that are being, followed through these events that are outside of what they're being, told to be. But all this was speculation. I think what I kind of came to realize is that these meetings are, a product I would want to say a product of genuine concerns by people. Whether they get changed into something else, the concerns by real people are are something that are at the root of these talks. And I'm wondering that if just simply the fact that there are these meetings and that countries have or feel an obligation to show up, whether they make great leaps and bounds in agreeing upon stuff is kind of beside the point. But the fact that they're talking about it and meeting about it and progressively, addressing or attempting to address problems is ultimately the benefit of these things. And that in a world where these things didn't happen, if, God forbid, something globally started to happen that was related to climate change that was really bad, we'd probably be in a worse spot in terms of acting as one community to address it. At least with these meetups that seem to go nowhere, or at least fall short in some people's opinions, there is a better chance that something can be done and would be done in a more quick, or sorry, I shouldn't say, in a quicker response than if these things didn't exist.
So your takeaway is more bureaucracy leads to things happening faster?
Don't you twist my words.
That's what I just want to make sure. Yeah. I got what you were saying. I don't know.
Yeah.
But I like that because it shows like different approach to me, whereas you were kind of maybe approaching it from a more good faith perspective, thinking like, they're trying, they're well intentioned, and maybe the origins of these things are well intentioned. I just think from a theoretical versus the practical, there's like a divide, because I think the question is, in theory, yes, there would be it would be better to have improvement, it would be better to have cooperation amongst nations for these types of large scale goals. But if we go down to the pragmatic actions of, okay, who does what is the responsibility, what is the distribution of actions, who does that fall upon? Can you come to the table with people that maybe have different needs? Maybe some people have the needs that your people had 100 years ago. You know what I mean? So they're dealing with problems that you had 100 years ago, but now you have different problems. So then you're thinking about it from a different point of view. There's like all these pragmatic things that come into play. And yeah, it just starts to look a bit ugly, which is maybe where it's worth mentioning some of the things that I found interesting from that resulted from the from COP26. So they talk about this goal of trying to maintain temperatures below the 1.5 degree target, right? Before it was 2 degrees, now it's like 1.5 degrees. And I think one thing that, so I kind of like going back to your idea of like, okay, we're coming together and we have a goal, right? So what is that goal? Or how would we measure whether or not these conferences are successful? Well, maybe if they came up with a plan that addressed a concrete goal, would that be a fair way of saying, okay, this conference was successful? If they could articulate what the problem was, articulate what their goal was, and articulate what the plan was to reach that goal, you could. I would say that, okay, that's a successful conference. Would you say that?
Yes, I think under the definition of what an actual successful conference or meeting is meant, you come in with an objective. That that objective is made clear. People leave with actionable items, and
right.
People follow out on those items.
Right. Totally.
However, what I'm saying is simply that maybe that's way too much to ask of multiple countries, and I'm just simply.
Okay, well, hold up.
Okay.
Before you go to that. Okay, I just want to establish the premise that articulating the issue, articulating the goal, and articulating the plan to reach that goal, it would be generally seen as a successful conference, right? So when we look at the goal of COP26 in a lot of these climate measures or whatever, it comes down to keeping temperature rise within 1.5 degrees Celsius, which scientists say is required to prevent a climate catastrophe, quote unquote, from BBC. I'm not sure which scientists they are quoting when they say climate catastrophe, but I'm sure nowadays our journalists can easily find any scientist to say whatever the narrative that they want to back, and they'll find the scientist, quote unquote, that will back that narrative. But that is to say, okay, goal is 1.5 degrees Celsius. However, the current pledges, if met, will only limit global warming to about 2.4 Celsius. So again, when we look at the overall objective and we say our goal is, the science has told us that our goal is 1.5 degrees Celsius, right? We shouldn't go over that because the science has told us that, it's quote unquote climate catastrophe will result if we surpass that. So how can we then think that this is successful if the pledges that are being made, if followed, which is in question itself, are only going to lead to a limited global warming of 2.4 degrees Celsius?
Right. And that's why most people say the things are a failure. They failed to meet the objective.
Right.
Now the question becomes, though,
or not even that they failed to meet the objective, or it calls into validity, or it questions the legitimacy of these things and what they are meant to do at all. For me, from my point of view, that's how I see it. It's like, okay, if you set up this is your goal, but you're admitting that the things you're going to do aren't going to reach that goal, but then you're also saying that if you don't hit that goal, it's going to be catastrophic. So then why are we doing these things that are only going to lead to the quote unquote catastrophe anyways? If you guys really believed in what you were saying, if you guys were really about what you were saying, then you would do the things necessary to keep it at 1.5. Now, that's not what I'm saying should be done, because I don't believe that there's a climate catastrophe as the way that is being portrayed by the media. However, it does say, like, it just, for me, just calls the question, okay, like, what's the game that's being played here? Like, what's the game?
I think the distinction needs to be made between the people that run these things and the viewpoints of the scientists that fall under that kind of thinking that these are hard objectives that need to be met, versus the political leadership of country XYZ, right? So it's like 100%. If it was coming from the guy that says, I believe in these things, we need to meet these objectives, and then he fails to do it, you'd say either you're a hypocrite or you're incompetent, because you believe this one thing, you didn't act on it, or you weren't able to meet it. That's a problem.
Or you're a liar.
You're a liar. Mm-hmm. Right. But I think it's...
And you're nefarious, and you have other objectives that you're not telling me about. Right. Sorry. But yeah. Go ahead.
So the thing is, so there's one type of person that really believes it, the scientist, or let's just call this scientist A. Okay. Then there's politician. Let's call this politician B, and he basically thinks he's a mouse. He comes out, he says he agrees with all this stuff, but then doesn't act on it. That's the liar. That's a hypocrite. That's the one that some people are more suspect of what their agenda is. Then I think there are others that they're showing up to these events. They're saying their bit because they realize this is a global thing. You might not hear them actually say as clearly that they'll say climate change is a concern to them, but they are careful about what they say they agree with, basically. And then those people act a little bit differently, and you can obviously see through their actions that they aren't trying to achieve the same goals. And so those people, I find them a bit more honest, because at least they're like, okay, we see it, we're showing up, but we're not going to say one thing and do another thing. We're going to try to be somewhere along the line. So I think these conferences are full of kind of mixed bag of at least those three types of characters. And
here's the thing, though. That's one model. Perhaps. So you have these three types of people. So you have the hardcore policy person, you have the hardcore science person, those two people might be on a different page. Then you have the third person, who I'm not sure I understood correctly, is the in between person that's kind of on board for both. Or if I
no, I would actually say, so to go over the three types of people, I'm thinking here is the hardcore policy and science person are people that believe what the models are saying and believe in the action, and if they had the power, they would 100% do it.
Right.
But they don't have the power.
So they're the true believers.
Yes.
Whether it's policy or science-based.
Right.
Okay, so that's person A, they're the true believers.
True believers.
Okay.
Person B is the they say they believe in them, but they have the power to make change, but they don't execute it, or they are perceived to have more power to make the change within their countries.
So politicians,
pseudo believers, yeah.
Right. They'll talk the talk, but they don't walk the walk.
They don't walk the walk.
Gotcha. Okay.
Then there's this other one that shows up, okay, believes part of what the policy and scientists is saying is a concern, that they want to be at talks at these meetings. They don't talk the talk in terms of saying exactly, I believe X, Y, and Z that the policy and scientists make, but they're there to do something about it. And that's what I'm saying is like those three people kind of make up.
They're kind of like the ones that are like maybe more the realists. They kind of see the issue. They want to hear what's up. They're open to the idea, hey, maybe we'll do something, but they're not like 100% like, yeah, we're going to like reshift our entire economic system.
To meet this goal of 1.5.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think that might be a good that's an interesting way to break down those three people. However, I would say that when we look at the actual reality of COP26, what is it? It is 26. What is it? What are the 26 referring to? It's the 26 nations that are a part of this, right? And when we look at this idea of the scientific establishment,
I don't think it's 26 nation. I think it's the 26th year that it's been going on.
Is it? I could be wrong. Sorry.
Yeah.
Correct me if I'm wrong.
I'll look that up. You continue.
Yeah. So what I was gonna say though is that when so we have these nations who are the tops, right? And they get together with or they combine the political minds with the scientific minds. And I guess the question is, do the political minds and the scientific minds unite, or do they? Do they act hand in glove, where once the scientific minds say something, do the political minds take action? I guess for the longest time, the argument would have been, no, the politicians are slow. Science makes their decisions, or science comes up to a conclusion, then policy takes a while to enact it. However, based on the last 18 months, what I've seen, or what we've seen, is that science and politicians can actually work very closely to one another. They can work very hand in glove to one another. And when scientists say something, say X, politicians are very scared to contradict them. They're very scared. Maybe COVID was one specific example, but I don't think so, because I think that this is the trend that our society has been going down for the last couple hundred years, where we've been kind of idolizing science as the new religion, essentially, as the new God, because we've replaced religion. So then when we have a society where our political class and our scientific class come together and they're more than willing to rule hand in glove with one another, that's where I start to doubt that model that you presented of these people that are kind of down, but they believe it, they have the power, versus the people that believe it, or like the people that talk, but they won't walk the walk. Like, I don't know. I just feel like from my mind's, like, once or from what we've seen based on the last two years anyways, if the scientific establishment is pushing a certain direction and there's more or less a consensus on it, then the political class is kind of bound to it. Their hands are tied. And I remember this exemplified by our Premier Doug Ford in Ontario, who was caught on mics saying or on video saying like, "Oh, I wouldn't. No politician would dare go against what their head scientists say," or something like that. Because it was kind of admitting how how our society really so highly regards science, and if our politicians were to anything that quote unquote contradicted the science, then they would lose their job, lose their confidence from the public, just because, oh, what, you're not listening to the scientists? Okay, kick him out, the scientists. And that's where the whole term technocracy comes in. The technocrats are running the systems, which is a term that is being used a lot, and I'm not sure if a lot of people are familiar with that term, a technocracy, but that's what it really becomes, which is when you have your political class unite with the educated technical class, and you rule essentially via this oligarchic framework where the elites of society, the most educated, the ones that know all the technical answers, they're the ones that are running society. They're designing everything to run in a perfectly operational, efficient manner. Technocracy, which is what a lot of people are scared of when they hear that term, if they understand what the hell that means. Because that's what China is. It's a technocracy, in a sense. And very scary.
And arguably, Canada and the U.S. are well on their way. So... Yeah, we live in strange times.
So again, I go to the temperature goal. If your goal is 1.5, your scientists are telling you, we've demonstrated in the last 2 years our faith in science 100%. If the science says it, then it's got to be 100% true. So science is telling you 1.5. By the way, did you check 26? Is it the 26 years or 26 countries?
26 years. So
26 years. Okay.
Last year was COP 25.
Okay, my bad. So yeah. So how many countries were there actually? Just out of curiosity.
I was looking for that number, couldn't find it.
Okay.
I got a rough count, but
not important. Yeah. But a lot of them.
Yeah.
So again, so one of my beefs was with temperature. Another one. Sorry, did you have anything that you wanted to touch on before we move on to the next?
Well, I just want to kind of discuss briefly the assertion about we're moving towards this technocratic way of doing things, and the politicians aren't willing to push against their scientific heads of policy, whether it's through a health department or climate related. So there is the argument for this way of doing things is that science provides a set of tools for analyzing the world and establishing truth and the understanding of how the way things work, and through that you come out with results and data that in the best case scenario is close to the truth and helps you fully understand how these things come to be, and that is good evidence to make decisions upon, because, well, hey, you're gonna get what you basically are looking for if you understand how things work properly. And so, it only makes sense that would be chosen above other models by people because of its track record. I think what is scary about what's going on right now is that the science is, we're really seeing the limitations of science, especially in an evolving situation, and the kind of desire to move quickly on topics that require just computational power and levels of modeling, and the limitations of modeling that we can do, the quote unquote in silico studies. So it's like, one hand, it makes a lot of sense to, trust in science and the evidence-based decision-making, which you always hear thrown around. But I think what is dangerous is when we get to the point where we no longer acknowledge the uncertainties, we no longer acknowledge the limitations, and we are just caught, just kind of going, well, we'll fall back onto this crutch, which is, we were following the science of the time. And, that just runs into a bunch of issues. You run into a bunch of issues. So that's my 2 cents on that. It's like, I understand, I think we both understand the arguments for this current relationship between politicians and scientists. But
yes. And I think it's like you said, there's good evidence for it, because in recent times, obviously science is being used for, developing a bunch of the technological innovations that we have in front of us, that it's like allowing us to communicate via these microphones and all of these things. I suppose then the question is it's like, okay, science is a tool, but then it's a tool towards an ends. But then what is that ends? And that's where science meets its limitations, because science doesn't tell you this is an ends that we should achieve. Science is a tool that once you establish an ends that's worth achieving, you can then use to create a hypothesis, set up an experiment, take measurements, analyze, was it true, was it incorrect, and then see what we can do in order to get towards this goal. But then again, it comes back to, is a society that's run purely on a technocratic methodology, is that society lacking its core values that are meta science, that go beyond science, that are not tied to any scientific principles, but are tied to eternal truths that were essentially predated the scientific methodology and process? And that's kind of like a little side tangent that we're going down now. I think it's an interesting conversation to have still.
Yeah, yeah. Sure. I feel like there is the very real chance that the decisions that are made from scientific methods will lack humanity, lack some sort of line that shouldn't be crossed, because it's very real to think that you can, understand the mechanisms of something, develop a model that predicts it very accurately. What is the outcome? The outcome is, let's say it's to save the most amount of people. That is the utilitarian, mindset. Mm-hmm. That model does some sort of calculations. Okay, these things need to be done to save the most amount of people. But when you actually look at those things may be awful for some people, for the minority of people. Yeah. But it's like, following the dictates of science and a justification for utilitarian thinking, the outcome, you could easily justify it. Oh, we follow the science, but I feel like there's a cautionary tale there, right?
Yeah, exactly. There's so many times where science has been used for
the greater good.
The greater good, which was actually a whole lot of evil and killing and all that stuff. Okay, so let's
pulling it back.
Shift gears back to COP26, and I want to talk about the idea of coal, because that was something that was mentioned in the conference, and how they were going to pull back coal consumption. And it's funny because this one BBC article that mentions a lot of what happened, what the results were. It says that there was an explicit plan to reduce the use of coal, which is responsible for 40% of the annual CO2 emissions. However, countries only agreed to a weaker commitment to phase down rather than phase out coal after a late intervention by our good old friends China and India. So it's like, okay, and I can't blame them, right? Because they need energy, they need power for their people. Obviously, they're becoming more and more developed, and there's more people exiting out of poverty. And one of the fundamental things that your government needs to provide you is the energy, right? It's like one of those basic components of life that we all need, that we kind of take for granted in the West, because we're so accustomed to flicking the switch and the electricity's there and turning on our oven and it heats on right away. but a lot of places in the world don't have that. So who are we to say that no, you need to not let your people have those fundamental human rights, or I mean, rights might not be the right word for it, but those fundamental human needs in order to have a basis upon which you can then go and fully experience the human condition. Not to be too abstract, but again, like, can we say to these countries don't use coal? I mean, clearly we couldn't, because in the last minute that they said, like, no, we're not gonna do it. Although this probably wasn't even last minute. It's probably just how they wrote it. It was probably like the whole time they were like, nah, man, we're not gonna cut it down our coal. And this is something that I also mentioned before we started recording, but how that could actually be a good thing, because in a lot of developing nations, as opposed to coal, what they're doing is burning manure or wood. And that is, from what I was saying, was much dirtier process. And we found some articles saying that this was actually controversial, but I think like it's pretty like ubiquitously assumed that wood generates less energy than coal per gram, and it generates more CO2 per gram. So,
and you have to grow and cut down forests,
right?
And if you're not growing it, you're basically reducing the number of trees in an area. Also, other problems with that.
Yeah, exactly. And I guess a little caveat was that this one article that was saying that there's actually equal emissions for coal and wood was if they're burnt on a dry basis, but of course we know wood is wet. We need to put energy to dry it, so it's kind of hard to make those comparisons.
Well, and I think, but the main point here is when you consider the way energy is being produced in a country, you got to think about what is it relative to what was being used before, right? Mm-hmm. Or an alternative to. Because right now we're in a situation where we have a lot of ways we produce energy that are quote unquote bad because they emit CO2, but they're not equal. They all emit CO2, but natural gas, when burnt, produces less CO2 than coal. People say there's obviously methane, which is the primary gas in natural gas. They can leak, and if it's not burnt, methane has a higher greenhouse gas potential. But it's relative to what, and also to, are they doing anything to post combustion of it to mitigate this stuff? That's just because we've discussed how silly the term green coal is in previous podcasts, but there is that's not to say that you couldn't use it in combination with something else, and it is better than what you were doing before, from a CO2 reduction perspective metric.
Or that there is a relative distribution of the quality of coal, and you could have some coal that is less pollutant in terms of the amount of CO2 that's generated per gram than another type of coal, just by nature of them being different quality, like a different grade. Imagine like your fuel at the pump, right? How you have high octane, low octane stuff.
Yeah, the purity of it, what it's mixed with.
Yeah, exactly. But again, I go back to this question of like, okay, we have our climate elites telling us that we need to reduce our CO2 consumption or CO2 production because we want to avoid the 1.5 degrees Celsius. But at the same time, we have these types of things taking place where India actually, funny enough, they're going to be increasing their coal consumption by 5% per year, if I'm not mistaken. So, jokes on you. Like, they're actually going to be increasing their coal consumption by 5% per year. And again, it's not to say that they shouldn't do it, because again, I acknowledge fully that these people need energy in order to have that fundamental basis of life, right? Clean energy, water, housing, heat, all the fundamentals of cooling. But again, when we're looking at just this whole thing of like, okay, well, we're trying to avoid a climate catastrophe. I guess it just goes back to the idea there's competing interests. There's a balance,
right?
There's competing interests here,
When we talk about competing interests, there's one way of looking at it is like, okay, does India just simply not think this 1.5 is a real thing, or is somebody in India going, we're looking at the cost benefits of this, and we're going, hey, yes, this is going to be a problem, and we're going to be impacted by climate change in the future, and this is going to, but energy needs is a real thing for a growing population, and we need to meet it somehow. Or
exactly.
But there's like this, this is what people worry about, is that there is the coal industry is in there. All they're thinking about is we need to sell more coal. It's our bottom line, it's our financial interest, and they're just in these events to basically push their monopolies. So it's like, we're here, burning coal. I feel like that's what when you listen to some sort of activist group, and this is a real thing, the financial interests of big oil and coal, no doubt, but that is the framework that like these countries that aren't falling in line to do the thing are being, they're being led by the financial interests of big coal or oil or whatever, right? That's
True.
another perspective.
Could be.
Yeah.
Could be. I mean, similarly, though, you could say that there's financial interests that have been shifting towards like the green movement in recent times,
right?
Too, right.
I mean, that's huge. Right now, yeah. They're because financial interests play a role in everything. Without a doubt, now that there's going to become larger and larger green energy providers that are going to be pushing their agenda for funds towards their projects.
And the speaking of funds, that actually, again, going back to the idea of how these the climate movement is getting quite a bit of financial backing to it too, which I don't know, doesn't necessarily disinvalidate it outright, obviously, but kind of like how you're talking about, there's all these financial interests with coal, and it makes you suspect when there's when there's big money involved. It does make you question people's motives, right?
Yeah.
So on the subject of money, though, there's financial organizations that are controlling $130 trillion that have agreed to back clean technology. So financial institutions, we're talking about banks, we're talking about insurers, lenders, all of these types of things. So we have $130 trillion of money that's willing to back clean technology. That's not an insignificant amount of money. And arguably, I mean, like, who's got bigger pockets there? Like the banks or the oil companies? I don't know. Like, because you're talking about how like the oil companies, the coal companies are pushing stuff in India, but we got $1 trillion banks pushing stuff over here with clean tech. So it's like, I don't know. We got like, who's got the bigger dick swinging, I guess, is the question. Because the initiative is an attempt to involve private companies in meeting net zero targets. So essentially what that means is, I guess, they're going to be backing up projects that have environmental initiatives associated with them and such. But it's actually really funny because so before, apparently these countries, they had a goal of hitting $100 billion a year by 2020, right? So what apparently they were supposed to pledge, the richer countries, they're supposed to pledge $100 billion a year by 2020 to this fund or whatever that they were then going to distribute to developing countries. So they had the money to invest in clean tech, whatever. But so in 2020, they missed their goal. They missed their target, which goes back to one of the sad realities of all these things, that you got to pay to play. If you want these things done, you have to pay. So they missed their target of $100 billion. And what did they do? They not only doubled down, they 10 times down, I guess, would be because now their goal is $1 trillion a year by 2021. So, and I guess maybe to reel that back, it's a prospect, how it's written. There's a prospect of $1 trillion a year fund from 2025. So I just found that funny how like they pledged $100 billion, they couldn't hit it. So now like, okay, we didn't hit $100 billion, let's go 1 trillion. Let's go to like 10 times that. Like, all right. Well, sure. Like, I guess that's one way of approaching goal setting. Double down. No, 10x. Not good enough. 10x.
I was reading that the way the Paris Agreement was worded is that 5 years after the agreement was established, all parties were supposed to meet again and establish more ambitious goals. So, it's one of these circumstances. Yes, so the initial goal was 100 billion. It was not met, but the clock ran up. They got to 5 years, and I think
here's the goal. All right, we did hit it. Okay, this is even more ambitious goal. All right.
The step from 1 billion to 1 trillion is crazy. But I wanted to say something about the 1 billion number.
No, 100 billion to 1 trillion.
Right. I wanted to say something about the $100 billion price tag.
Right.
In terms of dealing with this. So, okay. And I'll back up and say, there is a need for money to finance some of the solutions. The financing solutions, is a real thing, obviously.
Yeah.
Throwing money at something doesn't always fix a problem because you need people to execute it well and efficiently. And,
right.
You always fear that, for example, there's some nonprofit out there that CEOs, employees are making out with 3-digit incomes, but they're like, we're nonprofits, we're doing a good thing. And you go, okay, is this really the best way to use money to deal with the problems that this nonprofit is trying to do?
Right.
And that's kind of like a corrupt version of it. So it's like money needs to be thrown at a project. But I heard this 100 billion price tag, and I was like, in this day and age, is that really anything but peanuts? Because I was looking at the cost of an LRT, the light rail system in right. Ottawa. We're talking 3 billion, even more than that, for a light rail system to be built in one city, a small, not the largest city in Canada, big enough though.
Wait, but 3 billion over how many years for the LRT?
I think that was for phase 1, and right. which was over 6 years.
Right. But more. This is 100 billion per year.
Per year, right. So it is a lot of money, but keep this in mind.
Yeah, still big project.
Yeah. And $1 billion should not be underappreciated. The one way of
sneeze at.
Nothing to sneeze at. The time and time again, I go back to this great, not analogy, but way of looking at what's the difference between $1 million and $1 billion.
Right.
And when you put it into time, it's quite incredible. So for 1 million seconds, that works out to be 12, 13 days. 1 billion seconds works out to be like 30, 31 years. So the difference in magnitude of these numbers is truly astonishing.
Yeah.
But when you look at the price tags of infrastructure projects, if that's what we're talking about,
right?
For either,
it's pricey.
Those are pricey, So
these cost a lot for sure. It's just a question of like, yeah, how's that money being used? How's it being like funded, and who's doing the checkups? Because a lot of times you throw money at a thing, and what's actually happening is there's a bunch of corruption that's happening where on the facade, on the surface level, it seems like the money is going towards projects that are good in nature, for example, solving homeless or something. But then you realize that in reality, what you're actually doing is propagating a bloated, inflated, bureaucratic system that has no accountability, no oversight, no overwatch, and this money is being spent as a quote unquote investment, yet these people, they have zero accountability to actually show the ROI, to actually show what those dollars went to and how they profited back from them. And that's where things become a bit shady about this whole thing. Where like, okay, we're spending this money. There's targets, but where's the accountability? Where's the actual checkup? Like, oh, we targeted 100 billion, but that didn't work, so let's do 1 trillion. Okay, that sounds great, but again, like, where's the follow through? Where's the verification that things are actually being done? Like, like,
well, that's just it, right? And you can understand that countries, rightly so, are hesitant to put money into something that they don't feel has the right checks and balances, and maybe doesn't have a definable, this is what we're going to get for this price tag type thing, right? Mm-hmm. And so we should be clear though that the 1 trillion is not a confirmed target. It's like a target, the actual prospect. I think they're going to nail down what that next number is going to be in 2027 is what I read. But the idea,
could be even more, yeah. 1 trillion, 1.2 trillion.
It could be
1.2.
It could be more. I find it really hard to imagine that it would be more, given that they weren't able to address this, and now there's going to be more pressing things to think about following.
You don't think governments want to spend money? What?
What?
Really? I don't know.
They do enjoy collecting and spending money.
Copious amounts of money that hasn't even
amounts of money
been created yet. It's just so much money being spent. It's and then to what ends? And the question is, though, when we have the government spending money towards an end, what we're doing is we're saying that the government has more information on this thing than the market does, which isn't necessarily true, because markets are smart because of the fact that they can incorporate information at a quick rate. Governments are not smart because they incorporate information at a very slow rate. So that's where I go back to kind of like, if I'm analyzing the world based on that worldview, markets are efficient at pricing in information, governments are inefficient at pricing in information, then I'm like, is it really a solution worth pursuing, where you have an inefficient thing that's trying to regulate an efficient thing? Or let me put it this way, where you have solutions that are trying to be drawn up through an inefficient manner, I suppose. And I don't know, maybe, but then I guess you could say that these aren't the solutions. These are just money towards an ends. But then is it, sorry, I'm like talking to myself now. Like, are these ends worth, where essentially what I'm saying is that are the ends that are worth putting money into? So are the ends that these governments have targeted that they want to put financial institutions to fund, are those ends truly what the market would generate if we let things play out via the market, and also with a guiding hand that obviously, doesn't just let things go free, but let's prioritizes things such as environmental compliance, like not overly polluting, these things, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
it's a tough question, man.
I don't have an answer. I would say that you are correct that the market and the government at this point in time aren't dealing with differences in what they know. In fact, markets may have more data to at their disposal. I think the argument would be made that the market obviously needs financial pushes to make it do something in one direction or the other. Whereas the government the market isn't going to solve climate change unless you put a carbon tax. And even if you do a carbon tax, I'm not saying advocating for this, but the idea would be that you would have to put these prices in a way to get the market to influence, and that has to be done by some outside organization, which would be our government, to do that to get the.
So sometimes the end goal is legitimate, right? So we can look at like the vaccine. Well, depending on what your outlook is, but assuming that the vaccines are a good thing, then we can say, okay, which I do believe in general they are good. So we have this for COVID. We had an end goal in mind. We told our pharmaceutical companies, hey, we want vaccines. We don't care how much it's going to cost. We're going to throw billions of dollars towards you guys. You guys just figure it out. So it was a situation where we had a goal as determined by our institutions of our government, our science, our scientific institutions, and we threw the money towards our private industry, mainly our pharmaceutical companies, to then do the research, do the studies, experimentation necessary in order to develop the vaccines. So again, arguably, if you believe that that end trajectory that was set by the government of developing the vaccines was a good one, then we did put into action for industry to do it. But again, it was the industry that had to do it via the financial incentives, and assuming that those end goals that were set were legitimate, were good, and were true, were valid. So then the question is, are they in this case? Are those endpoints legitimate, true, and valid? Especially when you have these situations where you're making these compromises with India and China and saying, hey, keep on doing your coal. And you're saying these things that, hey, if we do all these things, we're actually not going to hit our 1.5 degree target. We're actually going to be at 2.1 degrees. So then that's where I go at. Is the end goal being set a true one? Is the end target being set a noble one? And when you have these nefarious things that happen, it puts into question is what else and that idea off of.
Yeah, I have. Well, I don't want to make this a discussion over COVID and vaccine companies, because definitely there's certain companies that actually received money from governments and some that didn't. But it's I think the question of does the ends justify the means, and are we establishing the right ends, the targets? It's what I think you mean by that. When you say ends, that's what you're talking about, like the objective, the targets. Is that another fair way of putting it? Ends. Okay, yeah.
Do the ends justify the means, baby boy?
Exactly. So that, I mean, is that's the $1 billion, $1 trillion question.
Okay. So yeah, we talked about some of the issues surrounding temperature, some of the issues surrounding coal use, and something I briefly want to touch on, which we kind of discussed a bit, was the idea of methane and how methane is really being demonized, and how there's targets to reduce methane consumption. However, when you look at
CO2 emissions.
Yeah. Sorry, what the fuck?
Running into some technical difficulties here, folks.
So one of the things that we talked about briefly was the methane consumption and how it's really being pushed back on, and how there are targets to reduce our methane consumption. And why is that? It's because methane is kind of seen as a greenhouse gas. It's got something like 21 times the global warming potential to CO2. However, people neglect that it's got a much shorter lifetime in the atmosphere relative to CO2, which is a side point. But there's a push to reduce methane emissions, and I think I want to just say how yes, burning methane does generate CO2, but again, it's kind of like what you were saying, is like relative to what? If we're transitioning from coal to methane, then arguably methane is actually a good, because you have more efficient combustion, you have more energy generated per gram, and you have less CO2 emissions. So you have less pollution that is generated per gram burnt. So there are benefits to methane when you actually take a step back and look at the context within which methane is actually being produced. And are we actually moving from a society that is burning coal, wood, cow dung to methane? Well, that might actually be a good and net better for the environment.
On top of that, what I've heard European energy CEOs talk about is this idea that we touched on in our episode on hydrogen, is that once you start to build the infrastructure around gas, you can start to blend combinations of hydrogen with CO2 or with methane, CH4, to lower the CO2. And so you have the infrastructure. Yeah, you got to upgrade your turbines to allow for that. But and this could be them justifying it, but I just want to make it very clear that the idea would be that if you have an infrastructure that handles gas, then you can start to diversify what that gas is. And if you were able to make clean hydrogen, something that could be run off of it, this is a step in the right direction if you're considering trying to reduce CO2 emissions.
And that's a really good point, because one of the things on hydrogen was that it could be carried. I think what I was saying was that it could be transported long distances by being injected inside of methane pipelines, right? LFG or I'm not sure if that's the right term, but yeah, basically pipelines dedicated towards transporting methane. You inject a certain percentage with hydrogen, and now you have a network that's pushing around hydrogen, which is an alternative to electricity. It's an alternative to our energy storage question, which we need to answer as it pertains to the storing of energy for our renewables. So current solutions are batteries, but of course hydrogen is another one. So I think that's a really good point that is worth bringing up as well, and how methane, even though it is demonized, there are a lot of environmental benefits associated with it. So I think we talked a lot about COP26.
High level.
Yeah, just to wrap it up, I think there's some benefits to talking about these issues and bringing it up, so that there's value in that. And I suppose, we can't always be skeptical. Sure, we should give them benefit of the doubt, but when you do see sketchy things in their objectives, such as claiming that this 1.5 degree threshold is catastrophic, yet everything that we're going to do is going to lead to a 2.1 degree increase, like these
or more,
more.
Yeah.
These inconsistencies makes you kind of question. For me, makes you question the validity and the legitimacy of what's happening. So that's kind of our take on COP26. A lot of talking, a lot of politicians saying a bunch of stuff. Will it result in anything? I don't know. But hey, if you like this episode, check out more at firstprinciplespodcast.com. You can find all of our content there, or check us out on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube. Leave us a positive review. We appreciate it. And get in touch with us if you have any ideas, any suggestions. We're more than happy to take a listen and see what's up. This is Trees signing off with my partner Elliot, this First Principles Podcast, and we'll catch you guys later.
Breakdown from the ground up. Peace.
Peace.